When she said the words, I felt the floor tilt under me. "We tied the knot yesterday," my daughter-in-law said with a smile like it was a weather report and not a knife. I stood in the living room that I had kept warm for decades, and the sound of her sentence filled the space like ice. I could see the beige sofa I had bought 20 years earlier, the coffee table with one corner chewed by old dogs, the framed photograph of my late husband on the mantel. I am a widow of 73 who has spent her pension keeping a roof and food for my son and his family. That sentence happened in the house I had named home for half my life. For 3 years, I sent $1,350 every month to cover rent and bills for the apartment my son and his wife lived in. Those automatic transfers added up to $48,600. I remember the exact date because I wrote it in my checkbook the day after I heard her say it. It hit me like cold water, not just because I was left out of their celebration, but because I realized I had been financing a life that had excluded me. I speak now in the first person, looking back on what I did next and why I chose to fight. What would you do in my place? The phone call came first, in the small hours, when the house hummed with refrigerator and radiator, and the curtains lay heavy with rain. My son Michael answered on the kitchen speaker, and I heard the scrape of a chair, the clink of a glass. "Hi, Mom," he said in that casual tone he uses when he wants to keep things smooth. Rebecca and I decided to have a private ceremony. We did not want a fuss. I asked where, who was there, what day, how I had not been told. She answered with clipped calm. It was immediate. It was a small thing. I asked to speak to her, and Rebecca put the phone to her mouth like someone sharing a secret. "It was just us and a priest from the chapel at the registry office," she said. "We did not think you would want to travel." The apartment smelled like lemon cleaner and coffee. I could taste the bitter coat of the moment, like black tea left to steep too long. My hands were dry and my palms prickled. I felt both shame and a cold, righteous heat. That night, I opened my folder of bank statements and found transfers labeled rent, groceries, utilities, a repair on their boiler, plane tickets, and an entry for new curtains with a receipt that had my name on it because Rebecca had insisted it would show respect. I counted. I set up a new column in my little lined notebook and began to tally every dollar I had sent since my husband died 5 years earlier. My backstory is not the kind you hear in a single sentence. I grew up in a small town working in a tailor shop alongside my mother. Sewing taught me patience and the value of a finished hem. I saved money from my first job to pay for nursing school, and I later worked 25 years as a community nurse. Marriage brought me a life I loved for 3 decades until illness took my husband. When he was gone, I kept routines because routines kept me steady. I learned to cook his favorite soups, to polish the silver, to arrange flowers on Sundays. Losing him also meant learning to handle paperwork, pensions, and bank visits alone. After retirement, I moved closer to my son to offer companionship and help with tasks he struggled with. My support began as small things like buying diapers and painting a faded kitchen wall. Over time, small things accumulated into a steady stream. I always told myself I was helping family the way my mother had helped ours. I believed love justified sacrifice. That belief is a thread I had woven for years, and the first time I realized it could be pulled apart was the night I heard about the wedding. Rebecca and Michael met at a friend of a friend party. He had always been charming in a way that made people forgive him for being late. She introduced herself as Rebecca with a quick laugh and eyes that missed nothing. They moved in together, and at first it felt natural to contribute. I fixed their curtains, paid for a new refrigerator when the old one stopped cooling in winter, covered the cost of a minor surgery Michael needed after a motorcycle fall. Those were real needs, and when I saw my son smile, I felt like I had done the right thing. It became complicated when the requests turned to regularity. It was subtle, a text asking if I could handle next month, a casual mention of a transferred bill that I already paid, a look when I hesitated that made me feel guilty. The line slid until I realized my bank balance bore the marks of a life I was not living anymore. That slow slide is where resentment grew. I did not recognize my own boundaries, and they learned that silence meant permission. The accounting began like a small private exorcism. I retrieved every bank slip stacked in the kitchen drawer. I opened old emails, I pulled receipts from shoeboxes and dated envelopes. I listed expenses and tied memories to each one. There was the $200 veterinary bill for their dog that I had paid because Michael said he had no savings. I remembered how the dog sat on my lap and how its fur smelled of soap and rain. There was a $700 repair to their car after a fender bender when Michael said he could not ask his employer for an advance. I remember the metal tang of engine oil, the smell of rubber and cold metal in the garage where I had waited while mechanics talked in low voices. I wrote down plane tickets that I paid so Michael could see a sick cousin, candles for an apartment that sat dark on winter nights, and the $1,000 deposit for an art class Rebecca wanted to take in a moment of reinvention. Each line had a memory attached, and each memory stained the numbers with more than financial weight. I tallied $48,600 over 3 years, and the total felt like a betrayal. The money was my pension money, intended for a private life of small comforts, doctor visits, and a long-deserved rest. Seeing the total made my chest ache. The reaction was immediate. I froze, then I acted. I went to the bank the next morning with my cardigan, my purse, the smell of old leather and lavender soap on my hands. At the counter, Karen, the branch manager, knew me by name from years ago when my husband and I opened the account together. I explained calmly, but with a growing tremor, that I needed to stop automatic transfers from an account to an outside household. "You can set limits," Karen told me as she tapped the keyboard. "You can place a block on recurring payments." Her voice was steady and smelled faintly of coffee. "I am sorry to hear that," she said. I signed forms with a pen that left a clean black mark. I felt paper under my fingers, the coolness of the ink drying, the faint metallic taste of stress. That same day, I told Michael I would no longer cover rent. "You cannot," he said angrily. "You promised." "I did not promise forever," I replied. "I promised to help when needed." Rebecca said nothing at first and then told me with a kind of hollow softness that if I cut them off, I would be cruel and irresponsible. "You raised him," she said. "You know how he is. He needs time." She leaned forward and set a hand on Michael's arm. The sound of her fingernails on his sleeve was a small, precise instrument. In that moment, I felt both fury and the old urge to fold, to smooth everything out. But something inside me had hardened like the crest of a wave that will not roll back. Backstory matters because it explains why boundaries were porous for me. My childhood taught me to mend and keep things together, to stay. I learned to equate care with duty. I married a man who trusted me with the household and watched me iron his shirts into perfection. After I lost him, I did not know how to ask for help without feeling as if I were failing. My empathy became a lever others could use. My nursing career had ingrained a desire to fix, to take responsibility for those in need. When my son stumbled financially, I stepped in because I had done it my whole life. That reflex was never about power. It was about keeping people safe. But when that reflex becomes expected by others, it stops being a gift and becomes the currency of control. I needed to learn the difference. Those lessons came hard. The first wave of resentment collected like rain in a gutter until it overflowed. I remember the particular smell of rain on concrete and the small, sharp sound of coins I tipped into a charity box. The same week, I discovered a set of receipts for expensive dinners with friends my son never mentioned. I confronted him in the kitchen, where the light from the window felt flat and too bright. The dialogue that followed was long and jagged. "Why didn't you tell me you married them?" I asked. "It was a modest thing," he said. "We did not want a big show." "You did not want me there," I said. "It was private." "We wanted privacy," he said. "Mom, you are making a scene." I am making a scene because I have the right to be angry, I replied. If you had told me, I could have come or asked me to help. You pay the bills, he said, in a way that sounded both accusing and helpless. That is enough. Rebecca's eyes were an unreadable gray. We did not think it mattered, she said. You were busy. The air tasted metallic like coins. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the neighbor's radio leaking a song I could not name. I felt my hands clench around a dish towel until the fabric left an imprint on my knuckles. That imprint became a pledge not to be invisible. The confrontation escalated the day Rebecca brought a woman named Patricia to our home who said she was a family attorney and had prepared a power of attorney form for me to sign. Patricia wore a blue suit and smelled faintly of floral perfume. She smiled in a measured way and placed a thin sheaf of papers on my kitchen table. This will make things simpler for everyone, she said. It will prevent complications if you are ever unable to make decisions. I ran my fingers along the paper and felt its crispness. Michael sat with a face that mixed urging and shame. Sign here for finances, Patricia said, tapping with a manicured finger. It will allow us to manage day-to-day expenses. I asked to read it and was handed a version filled with legal phrases that moved quickly and seemed to lock around concepts I barely understood. I asked if I could consult my own lawyer. There is no need, Patricia said smoothly, and the air tasted suddenly like metal and lemon. My voice trembled when I said, I need time. Michael's response was a low, hazy thing. If you do not sign, we will take it to court, he said. That sentence felt like a threat and a promise. The next morning, I packed a small bag, called my neighbor Mrs. Alvarez, and asked her to sit with me while I made choices about who to trust. For support, I turned outward and named people. Mrs. Alvarez, who had lived across the hall for 20 years, agreed to come by and sit with me while I made phone calls. Joan, my longtime friend, drove me to a small legal clinic, and the ride smelled of old leather and citrus air freshener from her car. I met an attorney named Daniel at a modest office that smelled of toner and coffee and leather. Daniel listened, his eyes soft behind round glasses. He asked me to go over my receipts and to make copies of everything. He instructed me to obtain medical records that showed I was capable of managing my affairs and to get a statement from my primary physician. He suggested installing a simple security camera at the door to document who came in and out. Tom, a young technician from a small security shop, installed a discreet camera that captured faces in grainy black and white and sent the footage to my phone. I could now see the small sounds of my life translated into pixels and timestamps. I named more people as I acted. Dr. Patel agreed to perform an evaluation to formally document my mental capacity. Officer Ramirez from the local precinct took a report when Rebecca accused me of harassment for asking the return of certain gifts. Karen at the bank put a temporary hold on recurring transfers. Each person had a role and a name, and their presence felt like stitches in a fabric I was trying to repair. The practical steps had sensory details I will never forget. The bank smelled of paper and old coffee. The security door closing with a weighty click that sounded final yet protective. Sitting in the attorney's office, the leather chair squeaked when I shifted, and the sunlight through blinds painted stripes of heat across my knees. At home, I taped copies of receipts to a bulletin board with yellow thumbtacks that stuck and left a small dull pain in my fingertips. The camera's little red light glowed like an unblinking eye. I remember the taste of cheap instant coffee in the clinic waiting room, the stale plastic of a pen I used to sign forms, the cool smoothness of laminated documents. These physical sensations anchored me when the emotional tide tried to sweep me back into silence. There is a technical part here I will outline briefly. To contest claims of incapacity and to protect my finances, my attorney filed a petition and requested a formal capacity evaluation. The process involves submitting notarized bank statements, affidavits from witnesses, and a medical report. Subpoenas were issued to produce original receipts and the chain of custody. For these documents was recorded to ensure authenticity. This paperwork creates a trail for the court to follow and prevents manipulation of facts. The preparation for court required careful collection of proof and convincing witnesses to speak. I asked Mrs. Alvarez to write a statement about the times my son and Rebecca arrived unannounced, about the nights they left lights on and doors unlocked. Joan gave a testimony about phone calls where my son sounded evasive. My neighbor Carlos, who worked at a bakery down the street, agreed to testify that he had seen Rebecca carrying expensive items into the apartment on days when my pension was debited. Dr. Patel performed a cognitive assessment and wrote a measured report describing my clear memory for events, my sound understanding of finances, and my ability to make informed decisions. Daniel coached me for cross-examination. He had me practice saying clearly what I had done and why. He told me to breathe and to answer one question at a time. We labeled documents with numbers and placed them in a binder with tabs. The binder felt heavy in my hands, and the texture of the tabs under my thumb became a physical rhythm I used to steady my voice. We requested the production of Rebecca's bank records and a list of transfers she had initiated. The legal team also asked for phone records that showed when calls requesting money were made and whether any calls were coerced. There were moments of tension that were almost cinematic in intensity. The first one happened in the courtroom hallway when Michael and Rebecca approached me before the hearing. I felt the carpet under my shoes, the humidity from the crowd, the faint smell of perfume in Rebecca's hair. "You do not have to make this ugly," Rebecca hissed in a voice meant to be private but loud enough to carry. "It is not ugly to protect myself," I replied, my throat tight. She leaned in as if to close space, and the sound of our breathing mixed like a small storm. It lasted seconds but rewired my resolve. Another moment came when the judge read the motion aloud and paused at a line about undue influence. The word landed in the room like a bell. My palms were slick and my knees felt like sand. A third tense scene was the cross-examination when the opposing attorney tried to paint me as forgetful and uncaring. He asked about dates and receipts and tried to weave confusion into my answers. I held my breath, tasted metal, and repeated facts like beads on a string. The last tension came when the jury went out to deliberate. The courthouse clock ticked, the air conditioner hummed, and each minute stretched and pulled at my chest. I learned in those moments that stillness can be its own kind of strength. Court day was a study in senses and protocol. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and old paper. The judge's robes were a dark, calming shape, and his voice rolled like a low tide when he spoke. The prosecuting attorney from Rebecca's side was a polished young woman named Elise, who had a clear, efficient cadence. Daniel, my lawyer, spoke in a softer register but with deliberate clarity. The opening statements unfurled like maps. Elise outlined a narrative of family choices and responsibility. Daniel painted a careful picture of coercion and financial exploitation. Witnesses stood and testified under oath. Mrs. Alvarez described nights she sat with me and the times Michael left without a word. Carlos, the baker, spoke of seeing packages. Dr. Patel gave measured testimony about my cognitive health. The cross-examination was a skirmish of words. Elise asked questions meant to suggest instability. Daniel countered with receipts, timestamps, emails, and the camera footage showing visits and deliveries. At one point, the gallery fell quiet when a recording played of a conversation where Rebecca suggested it would be easier if I were less involved. The sound of her voice in the speaker felt close, and the hairs on my arms lifted. The judge asked for clarity on the power of attorney document, and Daniel showed how signatures had been requested in moments of pressure, not in calm. Strategic sutures of evidence showed a pattern. The jurors leaned forward like people listening to a tide break. During testimony, there were many exchanges that each felt like a small trial in themselves. "Did you ever ask her not to send money?" Elise asked Michael. "No," he replied. "She offered." Did you ever ask her to sign this power of attorney? Elise asked Rebecca. No, she said. I only suggested it might be simpler. When you suggested it, were you aware of the balances in her account? Daniel asked. I did not look, Rebecca answered. Then how could you know it would be simple? Daniel pressed. We spoke about future plans, Michael answered, trying to soften his voice. Future plans do not justify automatic debits from someone else, Daniel replied. The room smelled faintly of dry air and dust, and the sound of pens scribbling created a wallpaper of low noise. Each exchange landed like a pebble in a still pond, and the ripples connected to form a coherent pattern. I had prepared for the emotional strain, but not for the small domestic cruelties that surfaced during the trial. There was a piece of mail in evidence, a postcard I had received from Michael when he first moved in with Rebecca, thanking me for everything and signing with love. The opposing counsel held it up and suggested it proved my consent was ongoing. Daniel leaned forward and asked the court to note the timing of the card and the increasing frequency afterward. It was a delicate arithmetic of dates and intentions. The judge asked for a written finding on undue influence, and the jury deliberated. After what felt like a day stretched thin, the verdict came. The court concluded, fingers, as I watched it go. I joined a support group at the senior center where I met Nora, a retired teacher who taught me to paint small watercolors. We named each other's colors and poured the smell of turpentine and watercolor pigment into afternoons. I started volunteering at a community kitchen with Carlos the baker, who taught me to knead dough with a strength that steadied my hands. Joan came more often, and we took long walks that smelled faintly of cut grass and diesel from passing buses. The emotional work involved therapy sessions where I learned to say no without apologies and to understand that refusing to be exploited is not unloving. I learned to separate responsibility from control. In practical terms, I set up alerts on my bank app that pinged my phone every time a transfer left my account. The sound of that alert was at first a jolt and then a small cheer. Months after the verdict, I used part of the restitution to make a small investment in something that made me happy. I booked a painting class in a coastal town and felt salt in the air when I arrived. I donated a portion to an organization that helps elderly people with financial literacy and felt a kind of neat joy in sending money to a cause that would teach others to watch for warning signs. I began to speak at a local senior center about my experience and found that telling the story out loud made it smaller and more useful. My voice, which had felt small in family dinners, grew steadier. I started a small notebook of boundaries with dates, reasons, and outcomes. It was a practice that made me feel competent. There were moments of difficulty after the legal victory. Rebecca tried to contact me through friends and via social media. I received a voicemail that ended with, "I hope you forgive me one day." Her voice felt like a window closing. There were nights I felt hollow and worried that the family fracture would never heal. There were days when I missed the familiarity of shared meals and Christmas trees. But in the steadiness of new routines, there were small miracles. I learned to cook one new dish each month, to bake bread with seeds that smelled of warmth, to keep steady plants on my windowsill. The money that had once vanished into the household of others now paid for a small medical checkup I had been postponing and for a modest trip with Joan to a lighthouse where gulls cried and the wind tasted of salt and freedom. Epilogue. 1 month after the verdict, I felt both fragile and relieved. I changed my account passwords in the local bank. The tech support rep, Tom, helped me set up 2-factor authentication and an email solely for bills. And I met with a financial counselor named Karen from a nonprofit who taught me to separate personal and family expenses. I attended a small mediation session where Michael sat across from me with his hands folded, and Rebecca did not attend. The conversation was polite but terse. I listened and spoke in measured sentences. I felt the spring sunlight on my arms and the coffee in my cup warm and steady. I started to plan a small trip. The idea of a coastal town with a secondhand bookshop took root, and I felt a cautious kind of excitement. 3 months later, I had sold a few personal items I no longer needed and used the money to take a short trip with Joan. We sat on a pebble beach and I let the grit of stones rub between my toes. I had new friends from the support group and I volunteered twice a week at the community kitchen. I painted small canvases and sold one to a neighbor named Sophia who hung it by her window. My sleep became more regular. The alerts on my phone no longer sent jolts but were a routine check. I had reconnected with a cousin I had not spoken to in 10 years, and their letters smelled faintly of old paper and lavender. My son did not come back into my life in the way he was before, but we exchanged brief texts and I could feel a slow, careful civility returning as boundaries held like newly planted fences. 6 months later, my life had been reshaped. I had joined a financial literacy workshop as an outreach volunteer and helped create a simple pamphlet for seniors about automatic transfers, power of attorney basics, and how to get a proper capacity assessment. I donated a portion of the restitution to the nonprofit that assisted me and became a guest speaker at their event. I saw Dr. Patel for a follow-up, and she smiled when she told me my cognitive tests were stable and there was no medical reason for a guardian. I treated myself to a small painting trip and met new friends who loved books and long walks. I no longer felt defined by the wound. Instead, I felt the possibility of repair and the accountability of self-care. I gave away a small sum to a local shelter, not to erase what happened, but to turn my experience into empathy for others. There is a lesson in all of this about dignity and power. Losing access to decision-making is a fear many of us carry, and giving it away slowly can feel normal until it is not. My story is one of many where love and duty were used to justify control. I learned to name what was happening, to seek witnesses and professionals, to insist on tests and receipts, and to protect what remained mine not as a selfish act, but as an act of survival. If this story resonates, please share it. Tell us in the comments what boundary you set that made a difference. If you are facing something similar, look for a local legal clinic, ask your bank to provide transaction reports, and consider having an independent physician evaluate your capacity. You are not alone. In closing, let me summarize in plain terms. I lost some trust and I gained my life back. I paid attention to numbers and feelings, to receipts and memories, and I chose protection over silence. I did not do it alone. People like Karen at the bank, Daniel, my lawyer, Dr. Patel, Mrs. Alvarez, Joan, Carlos the baker, Tom the technician, and many others named along the way helped me reassemble a life that had been frayed. If this touched you and you want more stories like this, consider following channels that focus on elder rights and financial empowerment. The most important person in my life became me, and that is the sentence I never thought I would write, but now hold as true.